Sometimes the answers we've been searching for all our lives arrive in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes through a stubborn old donkey that simply won't leave a young pregnant woman alone. In the dusty frontier town of Willow Bend, 61-year-old trail rider Hank Mercer thought his days of heartache were long behind him. But when his donkey Dusty fixates on a pregnant stranger named Clara, everything suddenly changes. The animal follows her everywhere, refusing to budge no matter what Hank tries. Then Clara collapses one morning. What the doctor discovers leads Hank to an impossible truth about his own forgotten past. What could link this aging cowboy, this stubborn donkey, and this woman's deepest secret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crept over the eastern ridge like it had for 1,000 years before, painting Willow Bend in shades of amber and gold. Hank Mercer stood on his cabin porch, coffee cup warming his weathered hands, watching the town come alive below. At 61, he'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the day demanded his attention. The air carried the familiar scent of wood smoke and dust, mixed with the faint sweetness of Sarah Chen's morning biscuits from the mercantile down the street. Willow Bend wasn't much to look at, not by city standards anyway. A single main street ran through the heart of it, lined with false front buildings that had weathered decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. The mercantile anchored the north end, its painted sign faded but still legible. Doc Brennan's office and clinic sat across from it, identifiable by the red cross someone had painted on the door years back. Further down stood the saloon, the boarding house, and the small chapel where Pastor Coleman held services every Sunday and Wednesday. Maybe 200 souls called this place home, give or take. And Hank knew most of them by name. He'd lived on the edge of town for near about 15 years now, ever since his body started protesting the long trail rides that had defined his younger years. The cabin was simple: 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch that faced west so he could watch the sunsets. Out back stood a small stable where Dusty spent his nights, though lately the ornery donkey seemed to prefer sleeping under the stars. Dusty, Hank smiled despite himself. The animal had been with him for going on 12 years now, a gift from a grateful rancher whose cattle Hank had helped drive through a particularly brutal winter. Most men would have wanted a horse, something faster and more dignified. But Hank had taken one look at the stubborn, grey-coated donkey with its knowing eyes and felt an unexpected kinship. They were both past their prime, both set in their ways, both content to take life as it came. The donkey had proven more intelligent than half the people Hank knew. Dusty could sense a storm coming hours before the clouds appeared, would refuse to cross a bridge if the wood was rotten, and had once saved Hank from stepping on a rattlesnake by blocking his path with that thick skull of his. They'd developed an understanding over the years, a partnership built on mutual respect and the recognition that neither of them needed fancy words to communicate. Hank drained his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. Time to check on his old friend. He made his way around the cabin to the stable, boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. The stable doors stood open, and inside Dusty was already awake, ears forward and alert. "Morning, you old cuss," Hank said, running a hand along the donkey's neck. Dusty's coat was rough under his palm, the grey mottled with darker patches. "Ready for another day of doing absolutely nothing productive?" Dusty snorted and nudged Hank's shoulder, a gesture that meant he expected his breakfast immediately, if not sooner. Hank obliged, measuring out grain and fresh water. While the donkey ate, Hank leaned against the stable wall and let his mind wander where it often did these days, backward. 30 years. 3 decades since he'd lost the only woman he'd ever loved. Rose Marie. Even thinking her name brought a familiar ache to his chest, though time had dulled the sharp edge of it. He'd been 31 when they met, still young enough to believe the world owed him something, still foolish enough to think love could overcome all obstacles. Rose had been 19, the daughter of a prominent merchant family passing through on their way to California. They'd had 2 weeks together before her father discovered them meeting in secret. 2 weeks that had felt like a lifetime. 2 weeks that had ended with Rose disappearing in the night and Hank searching for her across 3 territories before finally accepting she was gone. He'd never married after that. Never even came close. Something in him had closed off the night Rose vanished, a door locked and bolted against further heartbreak. He'd thrown himself into the work instead, guiding wagon trains, scouting trails, hauling goods from one settlement to another. The movement had kept the pain at bay, or at least made it easier to ignore. And when his knees started complaining and his back began protesting the long days in the saddle, he'd settled here in Willow Bend, a place he'd passed through 100 times over the years. A place that felt as close to home as anywhere could. The worn leather saddlebag hanging on the stable wall caught his eye. He'd had that bag since his early 20s, back when the world still seemed full of possibility. These days, it held little more than old trail maps and a few personal items he couldn't quite bring himself to throw away. Sometimes, on nights when sleep proved elusive, he'd pull out those maps and trace the routes with his finger, remembering the places he'd been and the younger man he'd been when he traveled them. "Hank, you coming for coffee or you planning to grow roots in that stable?" He turned to see Sarah Chen, standing at the edge of his property, hands on her hips. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had a presence that made up for her lack of height. Her father had come from China to work the railroads and had somehow ended up running the most successful mercantile in 3 counties. Sarah had inherited both his business sense and his unwillingness to tolerate nonsense. "On my way," Hank called back. He gave Dusty a final pat and headed toward town, the donkey falling into step beside him without being asked. This was their morning routine. Walk down to the mercantile, sit on the bench out front with whatever assortment of old-timers had gathered there, drink Sarah's excellent coffee, and discuss nothing of particular importance. It was a simple life, but it was his, and most days that was enough. The mercantile was already busy when they arrived. Sarah had set out fresh biscuits alongside the coffee, and the smell drew people like moths to flame. Hank tied Dusty to the hitching post, though the donkey never wandered far, and climbed the steps to claim his usual spot on the bench. Doc Brennan was already there, his medical bag at his feet. The doctor was a lean man in his 50s, with kind eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving. He'd come west after losing his family to cholera back east, had told Hank once that he couldn't stand to practice medicine in a place that held so many ghosts. They'd become friends over the years, bonded by their shared understanding that sometimes the past weighed heavier than the present. "Morning, Hank," Doc said, scooting over to make room. "Sleep well?" "Well enough. You?" "Up half the night with the Henderson baby. Colic, nothing serious. But you'd think the world was ending from the way that child carried on." They fell into comfortable silence, sipping their coffee and watching the town wake up around them. A wagon rolled past, heading toward the feed store. 2 women stood outside the chapel, deep in conversation. A dog trotted down the middle of the street, purpose in its stride. Then Hank saw her. She emerged from the boarding house across the street, moving carefully, one hand pressed to the small of her back. Even from a distance, her condition was obvious. She was maybe 6 or 7 months along, her belly round beneath a faded calico dress. She was young, mid-20s at most, with dark hair pinned up in a simple style. There was something about the way she carried herself, a wariness in her posture, that made Hank think of a deer that had wandered too close to civilization. "That's the new girl," Doc said quietly, following Hank's gaze. "Clara something. Showed up about 3 weeks ago. Rented a room at Mrs. Patterson's place. Keeps to herself mostly. She married? Says her husband's away on business. Hasn't seen any evidence of a husband, though, if I'm being honest. No letters, no telegrams, no mention of when he's coming back." Doc's tone suggested he didn't believe in this mysterious husband. Tried to get her to come in for an examination, make sure the baby's developing properly. She declined. Hank watched Clara make her way down the street toward the mercantile. She moved slowly, and even from here he could see the exhaustion in every step. Something about her tugged at him, though he couldn't say what. Maybe it was just the natural instinct to want to help someone who clearly needed it. As if sensing Hank's attention, Dusty's ears suddenly pricked forward. The donkey's entire body went rigid, focused on something Hank couldn't see. Before Hank could react, Dusty pulled free from the hitching post, which shouldn't have been possible given how well Hank had tied the knot, and trotted directly toward Clara. "Dusty! Get back here!" Hank pushed to his feet, but the donkey ignored him completely. Clara had paused outside the mercantile steps, one hand on the railing, as if gathering strength to climb them. Dusty walked right up to her and gently nudged her arm with his nose. The woman, startled, took a step back, then seemed to relax when she realized it was just a donkey seeking attention. "I'm so sorry," Hank said, hurrying over. He doesn't normally bother people." "Dusty, come on now." But Dusty refused to budge. Instead, the donkey pressed closer to Clara, his muzzle near her belly, and made a soft sound deep in his chest. It was a sound Hank had never heard from him before, something between a whimper and a sigh. Clara's expression softened. She reached out tentatively and stroked Dusty's long ears. "It's all right. He's sweet. He's a menace is what he is," Hank said, but there was no heat in his words. He was too busy studying Clara's face, trying to figure out why she seemed so familiar. He was certain they'd never met, yet something about her features nagged at him. The shape of her eyes, maybe, or the set of her jaw. "I don't mind truly," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, carefully modulated, a voice that had learned not to draw too much attention. "Animals have always liked me." "Well, you've got a friend for life now," Doc Brennan said, joining them. He tipped his hat to Clara. "Morning, Miss Clara. How are you feeling today?" "Fine, thank you." The walls went up immediately. Hank could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her hand moved protectively to her belly. "Offer still stands if you change your mind about that examination," Doc said gently. "No charge. Just want to make sure everything's as it should be." "I appreciate your concern, Doctor, but I'm managing well enough." She wasn't, though. Hank could see that clear as day. Her dress hung loose on a frame that should have been fuller given her condition. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her skin had a pallor that spoke of too little food and too little rest. Sarah Chen appeared in the mercantile doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Clara, dear, I've set aside those mending supplies you asked about. Come on inside." Clara nodded gratefully and moved toward the steps. Dusty followed right alongside her, matching her pace like he'd been doing it all his life. When Clara entered the mercantile, the donkey planted himself outside the door and refused to move, even when Hank tugged on his halter. "Well, that's new," Doc said, scratching his beard. "Never seen Dusty take to anyone like that." "Neither have I." Hank stared at his donkey, genuinely puzzled. "He's been acting strange all morning, restless-like." They returned to the bench, though Hank kept one eye on the mercantile door. When Clara emerged 15 minutes later carrying a small package, Dusty immediately fell into step beside her again. The donkey walked her all the way back to the boarding house, and only when she'd gone inside did he return to where Hank waited. "You want to explain yourself?" Hank asked the donkey. Dusty just flicked his ears and looked entirely too pleased with himself. That evening, Hank sat on his porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Dusty stood nearby, grazing on the sparse grass. The day had been routine in every way, except for that strange encounter with Clara. Hank couldn't shake the image of her face from his mind, couldn't quiet the voice whispering that he'd seen those features before. On impulse, he went inside and retrieved the old leather saddlebag from where it hung on the bedroom wall. He brought it out to the porch and sat down again, the bag heavy in his lap. His fingers traced the worn leather, following cracks that told their own story of years and weather. He unbuckled the strap and reached inside. The maps came out first, dozens of them, hand-drawn and faded, showing trails through mountains and across plains. Each one represented a journey, a chapter of his life when he'd been young and unbroken. He set them aside carefully and reached deeper into the bag, his hand closed around something small and delicate. He pulled it out, a pressed flower, brittle with age, its petals more brown than their original yellow. Rose had given it to him the day before she disappeared. They'd been walking along a creek, stealing what little time they could together. And she'd plucked this flower from the bank and tucked it behind his ear. "So you'll remember this day," she'd said, smiling up at him. He'd pressed it in his journal that night, transferred it to the saddlebag later. For years, he'd carried it with him, a talisman against forgetting. Against moving on. Hank held the flower up to the fading light, studying it. 30 years, and he could still hear Rose's voice, still remember exactly how she'd looked with the sun in her hair. Time had stolen so much, but not that. Never that. He thought again of Clara, of something in her face that had struck a chord of recognition. It was foolish, probably. The mind saw patterns that didn't exist, especially when you were old and alone, and looking for connections that weren't there, but still. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, that Dusty's strange behavior meant something beyond simple animal instinct. The donkey had never steered him wrong before. Hank carefully placed the flower back in the saddlebag, along with the maps. Tomorrow, he'd go about his business as usual. Tomorrow, he'd probably forget all about this vague sense of unease. Tomorrow would be just another day in a long string of days that all looked remarkably similar, except it wouldn't be. Tomorrow, Dusty would refuse to be hitched to the wagon. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change, but tonight, Hank sat on his porch with his memories and his donkey, watching the stars emerge one by one against the darkening sky, and felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in 30 years, hope. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Perfect weather for the supply run Hank had planned to the neighboring town of Cedar Flats. He'd promised to pick up some hardware for the blacksmith and deliver a parcel for Sarah Chen. Simple work, the kind that kept him busy without taxing his aging body too much. He had the wagon hitched and ready by 7, or at least he thought he did. Dusty had other ideas. The moment Hank tried to secure the harness, the donkey planted his hooves and refused to move. Not just refused, actively resisted, pulling backward with enough force to nearly drag Hank off his feet. "What in blazes has gotten into you?" Hank demanded, steadying himself against the wagon. "We've got a job to do, old friend." "Can't have you acting up like this." Dusty's response was to bray, loud, insistent, and completely unlike his usual mild-mannered self. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, causing several townspeople to poke their heads out to see what the commotion was about. Hank tried again, using his firmest voice, the one that usually got results. "Dusty, now!" The donkey wrenched free from Hank's grip on the halter and took off at a trot straight down the main street. Hank cursed under his breath and followed, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left, as a crowd began to gather. This was exactly the kind of spectacle he hated, being the center of attention, looking like a fool who couldn't control his own animal. Dusty didn't slow until he reached the boarding house. Then he stopped at the front gate and brayed again, this time even louder. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door, her face pinched with disapproval. "Mr. Mercer, control that beast. You'll wake everyone in the house." "I'm trying, ma'am. I truly am." He's never done this before. But even as Hank spoke, he heard footsteps on the stairs inside the boarding house. A moment later, Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders. She looked like she'd been awake for hours despite the early time, her face drawn with exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he calling for me?" Before Hank could answer, Dusty pushed through the gate, which Mrs. Patterson had left open, and walked directly to Clara. The donkey lowered his head and nuzzled her hand, making that same strange sound from the day before. Soft and almost protective, Clara's expression transformed. The wariness melted away, replaced by something tender. She stroked Dusty's neck, and the animal leaned into her touch like a cat seeking affection. "I don't understand," Hank said, joining them at the porch. "He's never acted this way." "Miss Clara, I apologize for the disturbance. Please don't apologize." Clara looked up at him, and for just a moment, Hank saw past the careful walls she'd built. He saw loneliness there, and fear, and a desperate kind of hope. "It's nice to feel wanted, even if it's just by a donkey." The words struck him harder than they should have. This woman was alone. Pregnant and alone in a town where she knew no one, with no family to support her, no husband appearing to claim her. Whatever story she'd told about business trips and temporary separations, Hank suspected the truth was far less comfortable. "He seems mighty fond of you," Hank said carefully. "Can't say I've ever seen him take to anyone like this. Animals can sense things, people can't." Clara's hand moved to her belly in that protective gesture Hank was beginning to recognize. "Maybe he knows I need a friend." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat from the doorway. "Miss Clara, if you're finished with your visitor, breakfast will be getting cold." The dismissal was clear. Clara gave Dusty one final pat and turned to go inside. The donkey tried to follow, actually setting one hoof on the bottom step before Hank managed to grab his halter. "Oh, no, you don't. You've caused enough trouble for one morning." This time Dusty came willingly enough, though he looked back at Clara until she disappeared into the boarding house. Hank led him back toward the cabin, aware of the amused looks and whispered comments from the townspeople who'd witnessed the scene. By noon, everyone in Willow Bend would be talking about how Hank Mercer's donkey had apparently fallen in love with the mysterious pregnant woman at Mrs. Patterson's place. The supply run to Cedar Flats had to wait. By the time Hank got Dusty settled and convinced the animal wasn't going to bolt again, it was nearly midday. He decided to postpone the trip until tomorrow, spent the afternoon doing odd jobs around the cabin instead. But his mind kept wandering back to Clara, to the look in her eyes when she'd said it was nice to feel wanted. That evening, he found himself walking past the boarding house. He told himself he was just taking a constitutional, enjoying the cool air after the day's heat. But when he saw Clara sitting on the porch alone, he wasn't surprised. It felt almost inevitable. "Evening, Miss Clara," he said, tipping his hat. She looked up from the mending in her lap. "Mr. Mercer, is Dusty with you?" "Left him at home. Figured the town had enough entertainment for one day." A small smile crossed her face. "I truly am sorry about this morning. I don't know what's gotten into him. That makes two of us." Hank hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Mind if I sit a spell?" "Please." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, Clara's needle flashing in the lamplight from the window behind them. Hank noticed the quality of the work. Her stitches were small and even, the kind of skill that came from years of practice. "You're good at that," he observed. "My mother taught me. She was a seamstress back in—" Clara stopped abruptly as if she'd said too much. "Back east?" Hank supplied gently. "Yes, back east." She kept her eyes on her work, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "I used to travel those territories," Hank said, keeping his tone conversational. "Trail riding mostly, some wagon guiding. Saw a good bit of the country before my knees started complaining about the hours in the saddle. That sounds like an interesting life. Had its moments. Lonely, though, more often than not. Never stayed in one place long enough to really know people, you know? Just passing through, always passing through." Clara's hands stilled on her mending. "Yes, I know exactly what you mean." Something in her voice made him look at her more closely. In the lamplight, her features were clearer than they'd been before. The shape of her face, the way she held her head, the line of her jaw, there was something hauntingly familiar about all of it. "Miss Clara, if you don't mind my asking, and you can tell me to mind my own business if you like, but where exactly did you come from? What brought you all the way out to Willow Bend?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I'm looking for something. Someone, actually. Someone my mother told me about before she passed. I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you." Clara set down her mending and reached into her pocket. She pulled out what looked like a photograph, though it was torn and faded with age. "This is all I have of her when she was young. Before everything went wrong." She held it out to him. Hank took it carefully, angling it to catch the light. The photograph showed a young woman, maybe 18 or 19, standing beside what looked like a wagon. Part of the image was torn away, as if someone had been standing beside her, but had been deliberately removed. The woman's face was clear, though, and beautiful, with dark eyes and a serene expression. Hank's heart stopped. He knew that face, knew it the way he knew his own. had spent 30 years trying to forget it and failing every single day. Rose. The photograph slipped from his fingers. Clara caught it before it hit the porch floor, her movements quick, despite her condition. "Are you all right, Mr. Mercer? You've gone pale." "That woman," Hank managed, his voice rough. "In the photograph. Who is she?" "My mother, Rosemary Colton. She died 6 months ago." The world tilted. Hank gripped the arm of his chair, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Rose was dead, had been dead for 6 months. And this woman, this Clara, was her daughter. "I never knew her married name," he said faintly. We lost touch before. She never married," Clara said quietly. "Colton was her mother's maiden name. She took it when she left her family." Hank stared at Clara with new eyes. Rose's daughter. This was Rose's daughter sitting right in front of him, and he hadn't known, hadn't seen it until this moment. But now it was all he could see. Rose in the shape of her eyes, Rose in the set of her mouth, Rose in the graceful way she moved, despite her weariness. "I need to find someone," Clara continued, unaware of the storm raging inside him. "Someone my mother loved a long time ago. She made me promise I'd find him, tell him she never forgot him." That she never stopped, Clara's voice broke. She pressed a hand to her face, and Hank saw tears slipping between her fingers. He wanted to speak, wanted to tell her that he was the man Rose had loved, that he'd searched for her, that he'd never forgotten either. But the words wouldn't come. His throat had closed around them, his mind reeling with too many questions and not enough answers. Before he could gather himself, the boarding house door opened and Mrs. Patterson appeared. "Miss Clara, it's getting late. Time to come inside." Clara wiped her eyes quickly and stood. "Of course. Thank you for the company, Mr. Mercer." She disappeared inside before Hank could find his voice. He sat there on the porch for long minutes after she'd gone, staring at nothing, trying to breathe through the tightness in his chest. Rose had been here, had come to Willow Bend at some point, and she'd had a daughter who was now pregnant and alone, searching for a man Rose had loved, searching for him. Hank stood on unsteady legs and walked back to his cabin in the dark. Dusty was waiting by the gate, and when Hank approached, the donkey nuzzled his shoulder gently, as if offering comfort. "You knew," Hank whispered. "Somehow you knew." Inside the cabin, he lit the lamp with shaking hands and pulled out the leather saddlebag again. He needed to look at those old trail maps, needed to see if Willow Bend appeared anywhere in his records from 30 years ago. Needed to understand how Rose could have been here without him knowing. But more than that, he needed to figure out what to tell Clara, whether to tell her at all. The night stretched ahead of him, long and sleepless, full of ghosts and questions that had no easy answers. 2 days passed before Hank worked up the courage to seek out Clara again. 2 days of restless nights and distracted days, of questions that multiplied faster than he could answer them. He'd pored over his old trail maps, searching for any mention of Willow Bend in his journals from that time period, but found nothing. If Rose had been here, she'd come after he'd stopped traveling these particular routes. Dusty, meanwhile, had made his intentions perfectly clear. The donkey had escaped 3 more times, each time making a beeline for wherever Clara happened to be. The first time, she'd been at the mercantile buying thread. The second, walking to the chapel for morning prayers. The third, sitting on a bench near the town well, resting in the afternoon sun. Hank had stopped fighting it. If the donkey wanted to visit Clara, so be it. And if Hank happened to accompany Dusty on these visits, well, someone had to make sure the animal didn't cause too much trouble. The truth was, he couldn't stay away. Now that he knew Clara was Rose's daughter, every moment spent in her presence felt like recovering a piece of something precious he'd thought lost forever. He studied her features, cataloguing the ways she resembled her mother. The shape of her hands, the quiet way she laughed, the thoughtful pauses before she spoke, all Rose, all achingly familiar, but he still hadn't told her. Every time he opened his mouth to explain, the words died unspoken. What would he say? How did you tell someone that you'd loved their mother 30 years ago, had spent 3 decades grieving her loss? How did you explain that seeing her daughter felt like being haunted by the most beautiful ghost imaginable? On the third morning, Hank brought work with him, a torn saddle that needed mending. He found Clara on the boarding house porch again, her own mending in her lap. The pile seemed to have grown. Word had spread that she was skilled with a needle, and folks were bringing her items that needed repair. "Morning, Miss Clara," he said, settling into what had become his customary chair. "Who brought you some business if you're taking on work?" She looked up, and he was pleased to see more color in her cheeks than there'd been a few days ago. "Mr. Mercer, of course. Let me see it." He handed over the saddle, and she examined it with the careful attention of someone who took pride in their craft. "The stitching's completely torn away here. I'll need to replace the whole seam, whatever you think is best. No rush on it." Dusty, who'd been grazing nearby, ambled over and positioned himself at Clara's feet. She smiled down at him, and Hank saw her hand drift unconsciously to the animal's ears, stroking them with gentle affection. "He really has adopted you," Hank observed. "I don't mind. He's good company." Clara began threading her needle, her movements sure and practiced. "Better than most people, if I'm honest. Folks been giving you trouble?" "No, nothing like that. Everyone's been kind enough. It's just—" She paused, searching for words. "It's hard being the newcomer, especially when people can see you're expecting and there's no husband around to explain things. People will talk regardless," Hank said gruntily. "Best to just live your life and let them make up whatever stories they want." That's wise advice. They fell into a comfortable rhythm. Clara working on the saddle, while Hank whittled a piece of wood he'd brought along for no particular reason. The morning sun warmed them both, and for a while, the only sounds were the rasp of Clara's needle through leather and the soft scrape of Hank's knife against wood. "Mr. Mercer," Clara said eventually, not looking up from her work. "The other night, when I showed you my mother's photograph, you had such a strong reaction. Have we met before? Did you know her?" Hank's hand stilled on his whittling. This was the moment. He could tell her the truth, or he could deflect, claim he'd simply been startled by the image. "I knew someone once who looked similar," he said carefully. "Long time ago. It caught me off guard, seeing the resemblance. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't exactly a lie either." "I see." Clara's fingers moved to her throat, touching something Hank hadn't noticed before, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. The gesture seemed unconscious, a habit born of repetition. "My mother wore her heart very close. She loved someone once before I was born. He didn't know about me. Couldn't know, I suppose, given the circumstances." Hank's pulse quickened. "What circumstances?" "Her family. They didn't approve of him. He was a trail rider," she said. "Someone who couldn't be tamed or settled. Her father thought him unsuitable." Clara's voice was distant, recounting a story she'd clearly heard many times. "They were supposed to run away together. She went to the meeting place, but her father found her there. Dragged her back, locked her in her room for weeks. Every word was a knife." Hank had imagined 100 different reasons Rose hadn't shown that night. But he'd never imagined this, that she'd tried, that she'd been prevented. By the time she escaped, Clara continued, he was gone. She searched but couldn't find him. And then she discovered she was expecting me. Clara's hand moved to her belly, mirroring the protective gesture she made over the locket. She was terrified. Alone, pregnant, disowned by her family. She had to survive somehow. "Your mother sounds like a strong woman," Hank managed. "She was. Clara's eyes glistened. "Still getting used to the past tense. She died of fever 6 months ago. Made me promise," her voice caught, "made me promise to find him if I could. To tell him she never forgot, never stopped loving him. That I exist because of that love, even if he never knew." The locket at her throat glinted in the sunlight. Without thinking, Hank asked, "What's in the locket?" Clara's fingers closed around it protectively. A lock of hair. And initials, R.M., Rose Marie. My mother put it there for me. So I'd always carry a piece of her, R.M. Rose Marie. The initials matched, but they could match a dozen people. Still, Hank felt the weight of revelation pressing down on him. This was his daughter. His daughter sitting right in front of him, carrying his grandchild, and she had no idea. "Your father," Hank said quietly. "Did your mother ever tell you his name?" Clara shook her head. "She called him the trail rider, or the man with the kind eyes. Toward the end, when the fever had her confused, she called out for someone named Hank, but I don't know if that was him or someone else from her past. Hank! She called out for Hank. He wanted to weep, wanted to rage at the unfairness of it all, wanted to gather Clara into his arms and tell her everything, make up for 30 years of absence in a single conversation. But looking at her, young, vulnerable, alone, and pregnant, he knew he couldn't simply drop this truth on her like a stone. She'd come to Willow Bend, searching for her father, but she was fragile right now, barely holding herself together. The revelation needed to come at the right time, in the right way. "I'll help you," he said instead. "Help you find this trail rider your mother loved. I know most of the men who worked these territories back then. Maybe I can track him down." Clara looked up, hope brightening her face. "Would you truly?" "I promise you, Miss Clara, we'll find him together." It wasn't a lie. They would find him. She just didn't know she already had. Doc Brennan appeared at the end of the street, medical bag in hand. When he spotted them, he altered course and headed their way. "Morning, folks," he said, tipping his hat. "Clara, I've been meaning to talk to you. Some of the ladies in town have been asking after you, wondering if you need anything. Baby blankets, clothes, that sort of thing. That's kind of them," Clara said softly. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden, dear. You're a neighbor." Doc's eyes were kind but assessing. He'd clearly noticed the weight she'd lost, the exhaustion that clung to her. "I also wanted to remind you about that examination I offered. No charge, as I said. Just want to make sure you and the baby are healthy." Clara hesitated, her hand going to the locket again. "Perhaps. Let me think about it. You do that," Doc turned to Hank. "And you, old friend. Nice to see you taking an interest in someone other than that donkey of yours." After Doc left, Hank stood to go. The morning had been emotionally exhausting in ways he couldn't explain, without revealing everything. "I'll come by tomorrow," he told Clara. "Bring you some proper food. Zara makes a stew that could bring a dead man back to life. You don't have to." "I want to. And when you're feeling up to it, we'll start asking around about your father. Someone in this territory must remember him." Clara's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer, for everything." As Hank walked away, Dusty trailing behind him, he felt the weight of his secret pressing heavy on his heart. He'd find the right time to tell her. Soon. He had to. But first he needed to understand what had happened to Rose after they'd been separated. Needed to trace her steps, understand her choices. Only then could he explain to Clara why her father, why he, had never come looking for her mother. Only then could he ask for the forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. The following week settled into a pattern that felt both natural and impossible. Clara came to Hank's cabin 3 times, bringing mending work that townspeople had entrusted to her. The arrangement benefited them both. Clara earned much-needed income, and Hank had an excuse to spend time with his daughter without revealing the truth that burned inside him like a banked fire. Each visit, Dusty would settle at Clara's feet as if he'd been doing it all his life. The donkey's contentment was palpable, and Hank understood it completely. There was something deeply right about having Clara near, about hearing her voice in his home, about watching her careful stitches repair things that were broken. She began to open up, slowly, like a flower that had learned to be wary of the sun. Small details emerged, how she'd grown up in St. Louis, raised by Rose alone in a small apartment above a tailor's shop. How they'd scraped by on Rose's seamstress wages, never quite comfortable, but never quite desperate. How close they'd been, just the two of them against the world. She never spoke much about her past, Clara said one afternoon, her needle flashing in the lamplight. The early years before I was born. It was like her life began the day I came into the world. Everything before that was locked away. Hank poured coffee for them both, his hands steadier than they'd been a week ago. Some folks carry pain that way. Keep it sealed off where it can't hurt them anymore. Yes, I think that's exactly what she did. Clara accepted the coffee gratefully. But toward the end, when the fever had her mind wandering, she talked, said things she'd kept secret for years. That's when I learned about my father, about how they'd loved each other but couldn't be together. Must have been hard, hearing all that when she was so sick. It was. But I'm grateful I know now, even if it came with grief. Clara set down her mending and looked at him directly. You said you'd help me find him. Did you mean it? I did. And I will. Hank crossed to the shelf where he kept his old possessions. I've been thinking about how to go about it. Figured I'd start by checking my old journals, see if I can remember who was writing these territories back then. He pulled down the leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years and weather. He'd started keeping it when he was 20, documenting his roots, the men he'd worked with, the places he'd seen. By the time he was 31, the year he'd met Rose, it was nearly full. This goes back to my early trail days, he explained, bringing it to the table. Maybe something in here will jog a memory. Clara leaned forward, curious. As Hank flipped through the pages, he was careful to angle it so she could see. The entries were brief. Weather conditions, trail obstacles, names of companions. But as he got closer to the year 1855, the entries changed, became more personal. More frequent, then her name appeared. Rose Marie, Clara whispered, seeing it on the page. You wrote about my mother, Hank's heart hammered. He'd forgotten how often he'd written Rose's name that year. It appeared dozens of times across multiple pages. Rose Marie, Rose R.M., sometimes just her initials in the margins as if he'd been doodling them without thinking. I knew her, he admitted quietly. It was time, past time. Your mother. I knew her 30 years ago. Clara's eyes widened. Wait! Hank held up a hand. Let me tell it proper. Let me explain. And so he did. The words came easier than he'd expected once he started. He told her about meeting Rose in a town called Silverton, how she'd been passing through with her family, how they'd fallen in love in the space of 2 weeks, about planning to run away together, about waiting at the meeting place all night while she never came, about searching for months before finally accepting she was gone. I never knew about her father finding her, he said. Never knew she'd tried to come to me. I thought she'd changed her mind, chosen her family over a rootless drifter with nothing to offer her. Clara had gone very still. Her hand clutched the locket at her throat, knuckles white. I stopped traveling through that area, Hank continued. Couldn't bear to be anywhere near where we'd been together. Eventually settled here in Willow Bend, but that wasn't until years later. If Rose came here after we were separated, we missed each other by... You're him, Clara breathed. You're the trail rider, the man with the kind eyes. She couldn't seem to finish the sentence. I believe I might be your father, Hank said softly. I can't be certain without knowing more, but the timing fits. The places. And Rose never forgot me, you said. I never forgot her either. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. All this time, I've been searching for you, and you were right here. Dusty knew. Somehow he knew. Animals sense things we can't explain. Hank's own eyes burned. Clara, I need you to understand. If I'd known about you, known Rose was carrying my child, I would have moved heaven and earth to find her. I would have torn apart every town between here and the Atlantic. You have to believe that. I do. Clara's voice shook. My mother, she said you had kind eyes. She was right. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of revelation settling around them. 30 years of separation, of lost opportunities, of parallel lives that should have intersected, all compressed into this single moment of recognition. May I? Hank gestured toward the locket. Clara nodded and lifted the chain over her head, placing it in his palm. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, as she'd said, was a lock of dark hair tied with thread. And beneath it, carefully engraved RM to HM, always HM, Hank Mercer. Rose had worn his initials against her heart for 30 years, had passed that devotion on to their daughter. The realization broke something open inside him. Grief and joy mingled so thoroughly he couldn't distinguish one from the other. She loved you, Clara whispered, until the very end. Your name was the last thing she said before she died. Find Hank! Tell him I never stopped! Hank closed his hand around the locket, then gently placed it back in Clara's palm. You honor her memory by being here, by searching for me, by carrying on despite everything you've been through. I don't feel very honorable. I'm alone and pregnant, searching for a father I've never met. Clara's voice broke. I'm a mess. You're my daughter. The words came out fierce, protective. My daughter, who survived losing her mother, being abandoned by a man who wasn't worthy of her, coming all the way across the country with nothing but hope and determination. That's not a mess. That's strength. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know what to do now. I came here to find you, and I have. But I don't know what comes next. What comes next is simple. Hank stood and moved around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. You stay. You let me be the father I should have been all along. You let me help you, protect you, provide for you and your baby. You become part of my life, and I become part of yours. That's what comes next. Are you certain? You didn't ask for this. I'm certain as I've ever been about anything. He squeezed her hands gently. Clara, I've been alone for 30 years. I thought the chance for family had passed me by. And then a stubborn donkey refused to leave you alone, and everything changed. That's not coincidence. That's something bigger than both of us. Fresh tears coursed down Clara's face, but she was smiling now. I have a father. After all this time, I actually have a father, and I have a daughter. Hank pulled her into an embrace, careful of her belly. She held him tightly, and he felt her shoulders shake with sobs, the release of years of searching, of wondering, of being alone. Dusty, who'd been dozing outside, appeared in the doorway and brayed softly. Both Hank and Clara laughed through their tears. He's pleased with himself, Clara said, pulling back and wiping her eyes. He should be. Smartest creature in this whole territory. Hank stood and helped Clara to her feet. Now let's get you fed properly. And then we need to figure out living arrangements. Can't have you staying at that boarding house when you've got family right here. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. You're coming home. Hank's voice was firm. That's final. For the first time since entering his cabin, Clara's face showed something beyond grief and worry. She looked almost peaceful. Oh, doom. I liked the sound of that. That evening, after Clara had returned to the boarding house to gather her things, Hank sat on his porch with the journal open in his lap. He reread the entries from 30 years ago. Young Hank's passionate declarations, his plans for a future with Rose, his anguished searches after she disappeared. That young man had never imagined this outcome, had never dreamed that 3 decades later he'd find Rose's daughter, his daughter, and have the chance to be the family they all should have been from the start. Life had a strange way of circling back on itself, of taking what was broken and finding ways to mend it, even if the mending came late and bore scars. Hank closed the journal and looked out at the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the stars, he hoped Rose knew, hoped she understood that her final wish had been granted, that their daughter had found him, that the love they'd shared hadn't been lost after all. It had just taken 30 years to come home. 2 weeks after the revelation, Clara still hadn't moved into Hank's cabin. She'd meant to, wanted to, in fact, but every time she packed her few belongings, something held her back. It wasn't doubt about Hank or fear of imposing. It was something deeper, a nagging sense that there was more to her mother's story, more to understand before she could truly settle into this new life. The morning it all came to a head started like any other. Clara woke in her small room at the boarding house, immediately aware of the baby's weight, of her own exhaustion pressing down like a physical thing. She'd barely slept, her dreams full of fragments, her mother's voice, Hank's weathered hands, Dusty's knowing eyes. She dressed slowly, noting how loose her clothes had become despite her growing belly. The mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, too thin, too pale, dark circles shadowing eyes that looked ancient in a young face. There was a knock at her door. "Miss Clara? You have a visitor, Hank. It had to be." He came by most mornings now, bringing food that Sarah Chen had packed, sitting with her while she ate, treating her with a gentleness that made her chest ache. He was trying so hard to be the father he'd never had the chance to be, and she loved him for it, even as guilt gnawed at her. She'd found him, yes, but she hadn't told him everything. Hadn't shared the other reason she'd come to Willow Bend. Tell him I'll be right down. But when she descended the stairs, it wasn't Hank waiting in the parlor. It was Doc Brennan, his face drawn with concern. "Miss Clara," he said, standing, "I hope you don't mind me calling on you like this, but I've been worried. Several people have mentioned they've seen you looking unwell." "I'm fine, doctor. Just tired. Humor me then. Let me do a quick examination. Right here if you prefer. Won't take more than a few minutes." Clara wanted to refuse, had been refusing for weeks, but something in Doc's expression stopped her. He genuinely cared. That was increasingly rare in her experience. "All right," she agreed quietly. Doc's examination was thorough and professional. When he finished, his face was grave. "Clara, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you need to hear it plainly. You're severely underweight, dehydrated, your pulse is weak, and I can see signs of malnutrition. If things continue like this, you're putting both yourself and your baby at serious risk." The room tilted slightly. Clara sat down hard on the nearest chair. "I've been managing," she said weakly. "You've been surviving. There's a difference." Doc pulled up another chair and sat across from her. "When did you last have a proper meal? And I don't mean a few bites of bread. I mean meat, vegetables, milk, the things a pregnant woman needs." Clara couldn't meet his eyes. "Money's been tight." "How tight?" "I have maybe $5 left. I've been making it stretch," but her voice caught. "The mending work helps, but it's not enough. I thought I could hold on until after the baby came. Find more work then." "Clara," Doc's voice was gentle but firm. "That's not going to work. You need help now." "Hank, no." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "I mean, he's already done so much. I can't ask for more. He's your father. He'd want to help." "I know, but there's something else. Something I need to figure out first." Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper she'd been carrying for months. "My mother left me this, along with the letters, the locket. She left me this." She handed it to Doc, who unfolded it carefully. His eyebrows rose. "This is a land deed. Property just outside Willow Bend. Purchased by Rose Marie Colton in 1855. My mother bought it 1 month after she was supposed to meet Hank, right around the time she discovered she was pregnant with me." Doc studied the deed. "The location, this is part of Henderson's ranch now. Has been for years, I know. I've been trying to work up the courage to go out there, see if there's any trace of why she bought it. Why she came here at all." Clara took the deed back, refolding it with shaking hands. "My mother never explained it. Just made me promise to find Hank and to understand why she'd come to Willow Bend. She said," Clara's voice dropped to a whisper, "she said the land would explain everything. Have you told Hank about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to investigate first, understand what I was telling him." Doc was quiet for a moment. Then he stood decisively. "Right, first things first. You're coming to the clinic with me. No arguments. You need immediate care, fluids, food, rest. Then once you're stabilized, we'll figure out this land deed business together. Hank will want to help with that too." "Doctor, I can't afford—" "I'm not asking you to pay." "Consider it a professional courtesy to Hank. He's a good friend, and you're his daughter. That makes you family to this whole town, whether you've realized it yet or not." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "Why is everyone here so kind?" "Because that's what people do. Now come on, grab whatever you need for a few days. You're staying at the clinic until I'm satisfied you and that baby are out of danger." Clara gathered her few possessions while Doc waited. As they left the boarding house, she saw Dusty waiting at the gate with Hank beside him. Her father's face went white when he saw her leaning on Doc's arm. "What happened?" "Clara, are you all right?" "She's going to be," Doc said firmly. "But she needs rest and proper nutrition. I'm taking her to the clinic. I'm coming with you." They walked together, a strange procession. The aging doctor, the weak young woman, the frightened new father, and the faithful donkey who'd brought them all together. At the clinic, Doc settled Clara in the back room, usually reserved for patients who needed observation. He brought her water, then broth, insisting she take it slow. Hank sat beside her bed, his face lined with worry. "Why didn't you tell me you were struggling?" "I would have helped." "I wanted to help, I know. I should have. There's just been so much happening, so much to process." Clara reached out and took his hand. And there's something else I need to tell you. About why Mother came to Willow Bend. She told him about the land deed, about Rose's purchase of property she'd never claimed, about the mystery that had brought Clara here as much as the search for her father. Hank's expression shifted as she spoke, confusion giving way to something like understanding. I need to see that deed. Clara retrieved it from her bag. Hank studied it carefully, his finger tracing the plot location. I know this land, he said slowly. Passed by it hundreds of times when I was still riding trails regularly. Beautiful spot. Has a natural spring, sheltered by cottonwoods. He looked up at Clara. Your mother bought this the month after we were supposed to run away. Yes, the records show she sold it less than a year later. To Henderson's father, apparently. She needed money, Hank said quietly. To support herself and you. But why buy it at all? Where would she have gotten the money for the purchase? I don't know. My mother was full of mysteries, Hank stood abruptly. I'm going to the county clerk's office. See what other records exist about this transaction. There has to be more to the story. I want to come. You need to rest, both Hank and Doc said in unison. Clara wanted to argue, but found she didn't have the strength. The broth and water had helped, but exhaustion pulled at her like a tide. We'll figure this out, Hank promised. Together. But first you get your strength back. Can't have my grandchild coming into the world with a mother who's half-starved. He left with the deed, and Clara watched him go with mixed emotions. Relief that she'd finally told him. Anxiety about what he might discover. And underneath it all, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of weeks of deprivation catching up with her. Doc returned with more food, this time soup with actual vegetables and a piece of bread spread thick with butter. Eat slowly. Your stomach's not used to proper portions. As Clara ate, Doc busied himself with other tasks, giving her privacy while staying close enough to help if needed. Through the window, she could see Dusty had stationed himself right outside, as if standing guard. That evening, Hank returned with news. He found Clara awake, propped up on pillows, looking already better with color returning to her cheeks. The county clerk had more records, he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. Your mother didn't just buy that land. She lived on it, briefly. The clerk remembers now, a young woman who went by Marie Colton, stayed maybe 8 months, worked as a seamstress, kept to herself. Then she sold the property and left town suddenly. Why would she leave if she'd established herself here? The clerk didn't know, but I asked around at the saloon too, spoke to some of the old-timers. One of them remembered something, said there was talk back then about the seamstress being in the family. Way, unmarried, the judge's wife, apparently made it clear such a woman wasn't welcome in respectable society. Clara's hand went to her belly. She was driven out. Because of me, because of small-minded people who couldn't see past their own judgment, Hank corrected firmly. Your mother did nothing wrong. Neither did you. She tried to make a life here, Clara said softly, near where you used to travel, near where she'd lost you. She tried to build something and they pushed her out, but she survived. Raised you, made a life somewhere else. Hank took her hand. And now you're here where she tried to be. Maybe that's what she wanted you to understand, that even when things don't work out the way we plan, we can still find our way home. Eventually. Clara squeezed his hand, too emotional to speak. Outside, Dusty brayed softly, and despite everything, she smiled. That donkey is absolutely insufferable, she said. Best friend I ever had, Hank replied. Until I found my daughter. Clara spent 5 days recuperating in Doc Brennan's clinic. 5 days of regular meals, fresh water, and enforced rest that slowly restored color to her cheeks and strength to her limbs. Hank visited every morning and evening, bringing food Sarah Chen had prepared and news from the town. The community had rallied in that way small towns do. Sarah brought baby clothes she'd saved from her own children. Pastor Coleman's wife arrived with homemade quilts, and even Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house sent over a basket of preserves with an apologetic note about not realizing how poorly Clara had been faring. On the 6th day, Doc pronounced Clara well enough to leave, though he insisted she continue eating properly and rest regularly. Hank had spent the previous days preparing his cabin, adding a room for the nursery, repairing the roof, building a proper bed frame. When Clara saw what he'd done, she wept. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, standing in the doorway of the new room. "Yes, I did. You're my family. This is what family does." That evening, after Clara had settled into her new home, she sat with Hank on the porch, watching the sunset. Dusty grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check on them both. The peace was profound, and for the first time in months, Clara felt something close to contentment. "There's more I need to show you," she said quietly. "About my mother. About what she wanted me to tell you." She disappeared inside and returned carrying a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. When she unwrapped it, Hank saw dozens of letters, yellowed with age, tied with ribbon, each one addressed in Rose's careful handwriting. "Letters," Clara said. "To H.M. My mother wrote them over 30 years. Never mailed them because she couldn't find you. But she wrote them anyway, as if you were there reading over her shoulder." Hank's hands trembled as he reached for the bundle. "May I? That's why I kept them. Why I brought them here. She wanted you to read them, even if it took 30 years to reach you." Hank untied the ribbon with careful fingers and pulled out the first letter. The date, June 1855, hit him like a punch to the gut. A month after Rose had failed to meet him at their rendezvous point. "My dearest Hank," it began. "If you ever read this, you'll know I tried. I tried so hard to come to you." He read about her father discovering their plan, about being locked in her room, about the beating that left her bruised and broken. He read about her eventual escape, about discovering her pregnancy, about the terror of being alone, and with child in a world that offered women like her. Precious little Mercy, the second letter, described her arrival in Willow Bend, how she'd chosen it because Hank had mentioned passing through there, because she'd hoped to catch even a glimpse of him on the trails. How she'd bought the land with money she'd stolen from her father's safe, her inheritance. She'd called it, taken early out of desperate necessity. Letter after letter chronicled Clara's birth, her first words, her first steps, Rose's struggles to provide for them both, her fierce determination that their daughter would never feel unwanted or ashamed. The years in St. Louis, working herself to exhaustion so Clara could have a better life than Rose had known. And threaded through every letter, and constant as a heartbeat, was Rose's love for Hank, how she'd never stopped thinking of him, never stopped wondering what might have been if only circumstances had been different. "She never blamed you," Clara said softly, watching Hank read. "Never once in all those letters. She knew you'd searched for her, knew you'd have come if you'd known. She blamed her father, blamed herself for not being strong enough to escape sooner, blamed the world that made it so hard for a woman alone. But never you." Hank looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I should have looked harder. Should have known somehow. How could you have known?" She disappeared completely, changed her name, moved to a different territory. "You did everything you could. It wasn't enough. It was all you had." Clara moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. "My mother understood that. She made peace with it in her own way. And she wanted me to tell you, wanted you to know that despite everything, she never regretted loving you, never regretted that I existed because of that love." They sat in silence while Hank continued reading. The letters spanned Clara's entire childhood, documenting Rose's hopes and fears, her small victories and crushing disappointments. Near the end, as Rose's illness began to manifest, the handwriting grew shakier, the entries shorter. The final letter was dated 1 week before Rose died. "My dearest Hank," it read, "I'm writing this with the last of my strength. The fever has me, and Doc says I won't recover. Our Clara has been so brave, so strong. She has your stubbornness and my determination, and I know she'll survive what comes next. I've told her about you, finally, after all these years of keeping you locked away in my heart. I've given her the locket with your initials, the photograph where someone tore you away from my side but couldn't tear you from my memory. I've made her promise to find you, to tell you everything I never could. If you're reading this, it means she succeeded. It means my last wish came true. I need you to know I loved you. From the moment we met until my final breath, I loved you. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger, braver, better able to fight for us. I'm sorry you never knew about Clara, never got to see what a remarkable woman our daughter became. But mostly I'm grateful. Grateful for the 2 weeks we had, grateful for the love that gave me Clara, grateful that even though we were apart, some piece of you lived on through our child. Please take care of her, Hank. She's been so alone since I passed, and she needs family. She needs her father. She won't ask for help. She's too proud, too afraid of being a burden. But she needs you, and maybe, in some small way, you need her too. All my love, always and forever, Rosemary. Hank couldn't read the last lines aloud. His voice had failed, overcome by the weight of 30 years of love and loss, compressed into ink and paper. He folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest, as if he could somehow transmit the message back through time. Let Rose know he'd received it. Let her rest easy, knowing her wishes had been fulfilled. Clara was crying too, silent tears that tracked down her cheeks. She loved you so much. I grew up watching her stare out the window sometimes, like she was looking for someone who never came. Now I know she was looking for you. I was looking for her too, Hank said hoarsely. Every town I passed through, every face in every crowd, I was always looking. They grieved together as the sun set, father and daughter united in their love for the woman who'd connected them. Dusty moved closer, pressing his warm bulk against their legs, offering the only comfort an animal could. Later, after Clara had gone to bed exhausted by emotion, Hank sat alone rereading the letters. He traced Rose's handwriting with his finger, imagining her bent over these pages in some small apartment in St. Louis, pouring her heart out to a man she'd never stopped loving. I'm here now, he whispered to the darkness. I've got her, Rose, our daughter, and I'll take care of her, I promise you that. She'll never be alone again. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and for just a moment, Hank could have sworn he heard Rose's voice carried on it, soft and warm and full of the love that had survived 3 decades of separation. In the morning, he'd continue the work of being Clara's father. He'd help her prepare for the baby, make sure she ate properly, provide the stability and support she'd been missing. He'd be the family Rose had wanted for their daughter all along. But tonight, he simply sat with Rose's letters and let himself grieve for all the years they'd lost. Let himself feel the full weight of what might have been. If only the world had been kinder. When he finally went inside, he placed the letters carefully in his old saddlebag, alongside the pressed flower and his trail journals. 3 decades of history now reunited, past and present, woven together at last. In her room, Clara slept peacefully for the first time in months, the locket with her mother's hair resting against her heart. Dusty stood guard outside, faithful as always. The donkey, who'd known before any of them that family had finally found its way home. The next morning would bring new challenges, preparing for the baby, dealing with Clara's fears about childbirth, helping her understand that she didn't have to face anything alone anymore. But those were tomorrow's concerns. Tonight, there was only the quiet settling of old ghosts, the soft breathing of his daughter under his roof, and the feeling, strange and wonderful, of no longer being alone in the world. Hank Mercer, who'd spent 30 years as a solitary man, closed his eyes in his own bed and smiled. He'd found his family at last. It had taken a stubborn donkey, a bundle of unsent letters, and more heartache than any man should have to bear. But he'd found them, and that, in the end, was everything. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to their lives that felt both new and ancient. Father and daughter learning each other's habits, finding their way around shared spaces, discovering the small ways they were alike and the surprising ways they differed. Clara had Rose's quiet strength, but Hank's stubborn refusal to quit. Hank had Rose's gentle heart, but his own gruff way of showing it. They talked about Rose often, not with grief now, but with love and remembrance. Hank would share stories from their brief time together, and Clara would counter with memories from her childhood. Between them, they built a fuller picture of the woman who'd loved them both. The woman whose absence had shaped their lives and whose final act of love had brought them together. But there was one letter Clara hadn't shown him yet. The final letter, not the one addressed to Hank, but the one Rose had written specifically for Clara, to be read only after she'd found her father. It sat in Clara's drawer, unopened for weeks. She'd been afraid of it, of what final truths or confessions it might contain, afraid that reading it would somehow make her mother's death more real, more permanent. But one evening, as she sat in the room Hank had built for her, feeling the baby move strongly within her belly, Clara knew it was time. She needed to read whatever Rose had left for her, needed to understand completely before her own child arrived. The letter was sealed in an envelope marked simply, "For Clara, when you found him." Clara's hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside was Rose's familiar handwriting, shakier than usual, written in her final days, when holding a pen had been an effort. "My dearest daughter," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've succeeded where I failed. You've found Hank Mercer, the man I loved more than life itself, the man who is your father, though he never knew it until now. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you years ago but couldn't bring myself to say. Things about what really happened and why I never went back for him." Clara's pulse quickened. She'd thought she knew the whole story. Her grandfather's violence, Rose's imprisonment, the pregnancy that had made returning impossible. But Rose's next words changed everything. "I've told you that my father found us, stopped us from running away together. That's true. What I never told you is what happened after. My father didn't just lock me away and wait for me to forget Hank. He did something far worse. He told Hank I'd left willingly with my family, that I'd chosen them over him. He paid someone to deliver the message, someone Hank would trust, and that lie poisoned everything." Clara's breath caught. The letter continued in Rose's trembling script. "When I escaped 3 months later, pregnant and desperate, I went looking for Hank. I made it to 3 different towns he was known to frequent, asked after him everywhere. But each time I got close, I'd hear the same story. Hank Mercer had been through, but he'd changed. Become harder, colder, started drinking too much, picking fights. The man people described wasn't the gentle soul I'd known. In the last town, I found someone who'd worked with him. He told me Hank had loved a girl who'd abandoned him without a word, that he'd searched for her, but eventually realized she'd chosen her rich family over a poor trail rider, that he'd sworn never to be such a fool again. The man I spoke with said Hank had specifically asked that if anyone came looking for Rose Marie, they were to tell her he'd moved on, found someone else, and wanted no reminders of his past." Clara's eyes blurred with tears. This wasn't the story her mother had told her growing up. "I was 5 months pregnant by then," Rose wrote. "Exhausted, sick, running out of money. And I believed that man. Believed that Hank had been so hurt by what he thought was my betrayal that he wanted nothing more to do with me. I convinced myself that showing up with a baby would only hurt him more, remind him of a woman who'd supposedly cast him aside. So I came to Willow Bend instead. I'd heard Hank mention it, a place he passed through regularly. I thought I could make a life there, be close to his roots without burdening him with my presence. I thought maybe I could catch a glimpse of him from afar, see that he was all right, and that would be enough. But he never came through. And then you were born, and I had to focus on survival rather than old dreams. It wasn't until years later, too many years later, that I learned the truth. I met a woman in St. Louis who'd known one of the trail riders from those days. Through her, I discovered that the man I'd spoken with, the one who delivered Hank's supposed message, had been paid by my father. Another lie, another manipulation. Hank had never said those things. He'd never stopped looking for me, never stopped loving me. And by the time I learned the truth, more than a decade had passed. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, understanding dawning. All those years, her mother and Hank had been kept apart not just by circumstance, but by deliberate cruelty, by lies designed to ensure they'd never find each other. I tried to find him again, Rose continued, but by then I had you to think about. A 10-year-old daughter with a life and friends. I couldn't uproot you based on 30-year-old feelings for a man who might not even remember me. I couldn't risk the rejection or the complications. So I stayed silent, Get my love locked away and focused on giving you the best life I could. But I need you to know this, Clara. Your father is a good man. The best man I've ever known. And what happened, our separation, the years of pain, wasn't his fault. It wasn't mine either, not really. It was my father's cruelty and my own cowardice for believing his lies even after I'd escaped him. I want you to tell Hank this. Tell him I never stopped loving him, but also tell him why I never came back. Let him know it wasn't doubt or fear or shame that kept me away once I'd learned the truth. It was my belief that too much time had passed, that dragging up the past would hurt more than help. I made the wrong choice. I know that now. But I made it trying to protect everyone I loved, you most of all. Find your happiness, my darling girl. Learn from my mistakes. Don't let pride or fear or other people's cruelty keep you from the people who matter. And please, please help Hank understand that he was loved. Always loved. Every day of my life. I loved him. The letter was signed with Rose's name and a final line. P.S. Take care of each other. You're all the family each other has now. That's precious. Don't waste it. Clara sat motionless, the letter trembling in her hands. Her grandfather, a man she'd never met, thank God, had orchestrated such deliberate cruelty, had paid someone to lie, had manipulated events to keep two people who loved each other apart. The ripples of his actions had shaped her entire life, had made her mother a single parent, had denied Hank knowledge of his own child for 3 decades. She thought of the locket around her neck, the initials engraved there, RM to HM, always. Despite everything, the lies, the separation, the years, Rose had kept her promise. She'd loved Hank always, and she'd made sure their daughter would know him, even if she couldn't be there herself. Clara stood and walked to the main room where Hank sat reading by lamplight, a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up when she entered, immediately concerned. "Clara? What's wrong?" She couldn't speak, could only hand him the letter and wait while he read. She watched emotions play across his face, confusion, shock, anger, grief, and finally a deep, sorrowful understanding. When he finished, he set the letter down carefully and removed his spectacles. His eyes were wet. "Your grandfather," he said quietly. "He paid someone to lie to me. Told Rose I'd rejected her. Yes, all those years. We could have," his voice broke. "We could have been a family." "I know." Clara moved to sit beside him. "But we can't change what happened. My mother knew that. That's why she wanted us to find each other now. To have what time we can." Hank pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I would have loved you," he said fiercely. "From the moment I knew you existed, I would have loved you. You need to know that. I do know it. I've always known it, even before I met you. Mother made sure I understood. You didn't abandon us. You never even knew we existed." They held each other while the lamp burned low and Dusty's soft sounds drifted from outside. Two people connected by love and loss, by a woman who'd spent her life carrying the weight of separation and had used her last breath to ensure they wouldn't carry it too. "We honor her by not wasting what we have now," Clara said finally. "By being the family she wanted us to be." "Yes." Hank pulled back and looked at her, really looked at her. "You're so much like her. Strong and stubborn and full of grace. She'd be so proud of you. She'd be proud of both of us, for finding each other, for not letting her father's cruelty win." That night, Clara placed Rose's final letter alongside the others in Hank's saddlebag. The complete story of Rose Marie, her love, her struggles, her choices, and her final gift to them both. As Clara prepared for bed, she felt the baby kick strongly. Her hand went to her belly, and she thought about the life growing inside her. This child would know their grandfather, would grow up with family, with love, with the connection Rose had been denied. The cycle was breaking, the loneliness ending, and though it had taken 30 years and cost so much pain, perhaps that was the final plot twist in Rose's story, that love, real love, could survive anything, even death, even cruel lies. Even 3 decades of separation. It just took a stubborn donkey to bring it all full circle. The revelation about Rose's grandfather's manipulation changed something fundamental between Hank and Clara. The walls came down completely. No more holding back. no more careful navigation of new relationships. They were family, truly, deeply, irrevocably family. And there was no more time to waste on hesitation or politeness. Hank threw himself into preparations for the baby's arrival, with the determination of a man who'd spent 30 years without purpose and finally found one worth having. He rebuilt the nursery room twice until it was perfect. Sturdy cradle positioned to catch the morning light, shelves for blankets and clothes, a rocking chair he'd commissioned from the town's carpenter. The chair was his favorite piece, made from smooth oak with a gentle motion that reminded him of rocking horses he'd seen children ride in his youth. Clara tried to protest the expense, the effort, the sheer amount of work he was putting in. But Hank was unmovable as a mountain. "I missed everything with you," he told her one evening as he sanded the cradle's edges to perfect smoothness. "Every birthday, every scraped knee, every triumph and heartbreak. I'm not missing a single moment with my grandchild." "Not one." Clara watched him work, her hand resting on her swollen belly. At 7 months along, she was finally healthy, truly healthy, for the first time since arriving in Willow Bend. Doc Brennan's enforced nutrition plan, combined with Sarah Chen's determination to feed her properly, had put weight on her frame and color in her cheeks. The baby kicked vigorously now, making its presence known at all hours. "You're going to spoil this child," she said, but there was no criticism in her voice. "Only love. That's exactly what grandparents are supposed to do," Hank replied, not looking up from his work. "Your mother would have done the same if she'd had the chance. I'm doing it for both of us." The town had embraced Clara completely once they understood her connection to Hank. What had been polite distance became warm acceptance. Women brought baby clothes and blankets. Men offered help with the heavier preparations. Even Mrs. Patterson apologized for not being more welcoming when Clara had first arrived, explaining that she'd been dealing with her own troubles and hadn't noticed how much help the young woman had needed. Pastor Coleman offered to perform a blessing ceremony for the baby once it arrived. Sarah Chen was already planning a celebration at the Mercantile. Doc Brennan visited weekly, checking on Clara's progress and pronouncing himself satisfied with her recovery. But as the due date approached, anxiety crept in around the edges of their newfound peace. Clara had never witnessed a birth, had no mother to guide her through what was coming. And despite Doc's reassurances, Hank couldn't shake his fear that something might go wrong. He'd lost Rose. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Clara too. One evening, 3 weeks before the baby was due, Hank found Clara sitting on the porch with tears streaming down her face. Dusty stood beside her, his head resting on her knee in silent comfort. "What's wrong?" Hank asked, immediately concerned. "Is it the baby? Should I get Doc?" "No, nothing like that." Clara wiped her eyes. I'm scared. What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not strong enough? What if—" "Stop!" Hank sat beside her and took her hand. "You're Rose's daughter." "My daughter. You're strong enough for anything. Mother almost died having me, she told me once. Said if there'd been any complications at all, she wouldn't have made it because she was alone with no help. But you're not alone. You have me, Doc Brennan, this entire town. And Rose, she survived that. Survived everything that came after. That strength is in you too." Clara leaned against his shoulder. "What if the baby doesn't like me? What if I'm a terrible mother?" "Then you'll figure it out as you go, same as every parent in history." Hank put his arm around her. "Clara, I didn't know you existed until 2 months ago. Didn't know the first thing about being a father. But we're figuring it out, aren't we? We're doing all right. More than all right," she admitted. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. After a while, Hank stood and went inside, returning with something small clenched in his fist. "I want to show you something," he said, sitting back down. He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold ring, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's wedding band. Only family heirloom I have. My parents died when I was young, barely remember them if I'm honest. But I kept this all these years. Thought maybe someday I'd have family to pass it to." Clara looked at the ring, its gold catching the fading light. "Now I do," Hank continued. "I want you to have it. For the baby when they're grown. A piece of family history. proof that they come from people who loved hard and endured through hardship. I can't take this. You can and you will. Hank pressed the ring into her palm. It's been sitting in a box for 40 years, doing nobody any good. Time it became part of a living legacy, instead of just a memory of the dead. Clara closed her fingers around the ring, feeling its weight. Thank you, she whispered. For this, for everything. I came here looking for answers about my mother's past, and I found family, Hank finished. We both did. The next weeks were a blur of final preparations and growing anticipation. Hank showed Clara how to swaddle, using one of Sarah's dolls as a model. Doc Brennan went over what to expect during labor, matter-of-fact and reassuring. The nursery was stocked with blankets, diapers, and tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small. Clara took to wearing the ring on a chain around her neck, alongside her mother's locket. Past and future together. She caught Hank looking at it sometimes, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride mixed with sorrow. Joy tinged with regret for all the years lost. One afternoon, 2 weeks before her due date, Clara and Hank took a walk to the land Rose had once owned. Henderson had given them permission to visit, curious about why they wanted to see that particular plot. They stood in the clearing, surrounded by cottonwoods, listening to water bubble from the natural spring. This is where she tried to build a life, Clara said softly. Where she hoped to maybe see you pass by on the trails. It's beautiful, Hank replied. She always did have good instincts about land. They explored the area, finding the remains of a small structure that had long since rotted away, probably the cabin Rose had lived in during her brief time here. Clara knelt carefully, her belly making movement awkward, and brushed dirt away from what looked like a stone hearth. She cooked here, Clara murmured. Sat here in the evenings, pregnant with me, alone but hoping. Trying to make something work. She succeeded, Hank said. Maybe not the way she planned, but she raised you right. Made sure you'd survive. Taught you to be strong. That's success in my book. I wish I could tell her that. Wish she could see that her plan worked, that we found each other. Maybe she knows. Hank looked up at the sky, clear and endless. I'm not much for religion, but I like to think she's somewhere watching. Pleased with herself for being so stubborn, even death couldn't stop her from bringing us together. Clara laughed despite her tears. That sounds exactly like something she'd do. They walked back to town slowly, stopping often to rest, as Clara's energy flagged. Dusty followed at their heels, protective as always. When they reached the cabin, Clara was exhausted but peaceful. Thank you for taking me there, she said. I needed to see it. To understand what she'd tried to do. Any time you want to go back, we will, Hank promised. That land is part of your history now, part of our family's story. That night, as Hank sat on his porch whittling a small wooden horse he'd started making for the baby, Doc Brennan stopped by. Wanted to check in, Doc said, accepting the coffee Hank offered. See how you're holding up. Big week or two ahead. I'm terrified, Hank admitted. What if something goes wrong? What if I lose her? You won't. Clara's healthy now, strong. The baby's positioned right, heartbeat is good. Everything points to a normal delivery. Doc paused. But even if complications arise, which I don't expect, we'll handle them. I've delivered more babies than I can count. Haven't lost a mother in 15 years, and I don't plan to start now. Rose almost died having Clara. Rose was alone, malnourished, probably terrified. Clara has none of those disadvantages. She has you, she has me, she has this whole town ready to help. Makes all the difference in the world. After Doc left, Hank finished the wooden horse and set it on the nursery shelf. Tomorrow he'd carve another, maybe a donkey this time in honor of Dusty. He had time. At least 2 weeks, probably more. But as it turned out, the baby had other plans. The next morning, just as dawn broke over the eastern ridge, Clara's water broke. Labor had begun. Hank sent the stable boy running for Doc Brennan while he helped Clara to her bed, trying to remember everything Doc had told them about what to do. Clara was calm, calmer than Hank felt, gripping his hand through the first contractions. It's happening, she said, wonder and fear mixed in her voice. I'm going to meet my baby today. And you're going to be fine, Hank said, with more confidence than he felt. You're Rose's daughter. "You're my daughter. You can do anything." Outside, Dusty began to bray, loud, insistent, as if announcing to the whole territory that something momentous was about to happen. The donkey, as always, was right. Doc Brennan arrived within minutes, his medical bag already open, before he'd crossed the threshold. He assessed Clara quickly, his hands gentle but efficient, his manner calm in that way doctors develop after years of practice. "First baby?" he asked Clara, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," she managed between contractions. "You're doing fine. Contractions are still far apart. We've got time." He turned to Hank. "Boil water. Lots of it. Get clean towels ready. Then come back here. She's going to need you." Hank moved like a man in a dream, following Doc's instructions precisely. The kitchen became a blur of steam and preparation. He could hear Clara's breathing from the bedroom, controlled at first, but growing more strained as the contractions intensified. Each sound was a knife to his heart. When he returned with the supplies, Doc had Clara propped up with pillows, her hair tied back, her face already sheened with sweat. "Hank," she reached for him, and he was at her side immediately. "I'm here. Not going anywhere." The morning stretched into afternoon. Labor was slow. Doc said that was normal for first births, nothing to worry about, but Clara was tiring. Hank could see it in the shadows under her eyes, in the way her grip on his hand weakened between contractions, only to become crushing when the next wave hit. "Tell me a story," Clara gasped during a brief respite. "About the trails, about Mother, anything," so Hank talked. He told her about the time Rose had tried to cook over a campfire and burned the beans so badly they'd had to throw out the pot. About how she'd laugh at his terrible jokes, the kind of laugh that made you want to keep telling terrible jokes just to hear it again. About the way she'd looked at stars, like she was reading secrets in them that were hers alone. Outside, Dusty's braying had attracted attention. Townspeople began to gather, not intrusively but present. Sarah Chen arrived with food that Hank couldn't imagine eating. Pastor Coleman came to offer prayers if wanted. Others simply stood in quiet vigil, waiting for news. As the sun began its descent, Doc's expression grew more serious. The labor wasn't progressing as it should. Clara's strength was waning, and the baby, though the heartbeat remained strong, wasn't moving into position properly. "Clara," Doc said gently, "I need you to listen carefully. The baby's stuck. Not badly, but enough that we need to help things along. I'm going to use forceps. It's going to hurt, and you're going to need to push harder than you have been. Can you do that?" Clara's face was pale, exhausted. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Hank said fiercely. "You're the strongest person I know. You crossed half the country alone. You survived losing your mother. You found me when I'd given up hope of family. You can do this." "Your father's right," Doc added. "I've seen you come back from the edge of malnutrition. You're a fighter, Clara. Time to prove it one more time." Clara nodded, gathering herself. Hank moved behind her, supporting her back, letting her lean against him. He could feel her trembling with exhaustion, feel every breath she took, every moment of pain. On the next contraction, Doc instructed, "Push like your life depends on it." The contraction came, and Clara screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore through Hank like a blade. But she pushed, and pushed again, and again. "I can see the head," Doc said, excitement breaking through his professional calm. "One more, Clara, one more big push." Clara was weeping now, from pain and exhaustion and fear. But she gathered every last bit of strength she had, every ounce of determination she'd inherited from Rose and from Hank himself. And she pushed. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then a baby's cry filled the room. "It's a girl," Doc announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A healthy baby girl." Hank couldn't see through his tears, couldn't speak, could only hold Clara as she sobbed in relief and joy and exhaustion. Doc worked quickly, cleaning the baby, checking her over with practiced efficiency. "Perfect," he murmured. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that work beautifully. "Clara, you want to hold your daughter?" He placed the tiny bundle in Clara's arms. She looked down at the red, wrinkled face of her baby and let out a laugh that was half sob. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one." "I'm your mama." Hank leaned over to look at his granddaughter, this tiny miracle who'd entered the world fighting and screaming just like her grandmother and mother before her. She had a shock of dark hair, already drying into soft curls. Her eyes, the blurry blue of all newborns, seemed to look right at him. "She's perfect," he managed. "Absolutely perfect." Clara reached for something beside the bed, a blanket that had been folded there, waiting. It was old, hand-stitched with care, the fabric soft from years and washing. Rose had made it for Clara when she was a baby, and Clara had brought it with her across the country, saving it for this exact moment. "Welcome to the world, little Rose," Clara said softly, wrapping her daughter in her grandmother's blanket. "You're so loved. So very loved." Outside, Dusty's triumphant bray announced to all of Willow Bend that the newest member of their community had arrived. Doc Brennan continued his work, tending to Clara with the same careful attention he'd given the baby. He checked for complications, ensured everything had gone as it should, his movements practiced and sure. When he was satisfied, he stepped back and allowed himself a small smile. "Both mother and baby are doing beautifully," he announced. "Clara, you'll be sore for a few days and you'll need rest. But you did it. You're going to be fine." The relief that washed over Hank was so powerful, it nearly brought him to his knees. He'd been holding his breath without realizing it, every muscle tensed against potential catastrophe. But Clara was alive. The baby was healthy. They'd made it through. "Can I—" Hank's voice cracked. "Can I hold her?" Clara looked up at him, exhausted but radiant. "Of course. She's your granddaughter." Doc helped transfer the tiny bundle from Clara's arms to Hank's. The baby, little Rose, weighed almost nothing, felt impossibly fragile in his weathered hands. She'd stopped crying and was making small sounds, little sighs and grunts as she settled into his arms. Hank stared down at her, this perfect tiny person who carried his blood and Rose's legacy. Her small hand escaped the blanket and waved aimlessly in the air. Without thinking, he offered his finger, and the baby's hand closed around it with surprising strength. "Strong grip," he murmured. "That's good. She's going to need that. Just like her great-grandmother," Clara said softly. "And her grandfather." The baby's eyes opened, unfocused but searching. Hank found himself talking to her, his voice low and gentle. "Hello there, little Rose. I'm your grandpa. I didn't know I was going to be a grandpa until a few months ago, but it turns out I've been waiting my whole life for you. You've got big shoes to fill. You're named after the finest woman I ever knew. But don't worry about that yet. Right now you just need to grow strong and know you're loved." Doc cleared his throat, and Hank looked up to see the old physician wiping his eyes. "Sorry," Doc said gruffly. "Gets me every time. New life coming into the world never stops being a miracle." There was a tentative knock at the door. Sarah Chen's voice called from outside. "Doc, is everything all right? Can we tell people?" "Come in," Clara said. "Let them see her." Sarah entered first, followed by Pastor Coleman and his wife. They crowded around, cooing over the baby, exclaiming at her tiny features. Word spread quickly, and soon there was a steady stream of visitors, townspeople who'd been waiting outside for hours, relieved and joyful at the news. Each visitor brought something, a jar of preserves, a knitted hat, a small toy. The nursery began to fill with gifts, tangible proof of the community's embrace of this new family. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house arrived with tears in her eyes and an apology on her lips. "I should have been kinder when you first arrived," she said to Clara. "Should have seen you needed help." "I'm sorry. You're here now," Clara replied. "That's what matters." As evening fell, Doc shooed most of the visitors away, insisting Clara needed rest. The baby had nursed, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, and now slept peacefully in the cradle Hank had built. Clara was propped up in bed, exhausted but unable to stop smiling. Hank sat beside her, watching his granddaughter sleep. The room was quiet except for the baby's soft breathing and the distant sound of celebration from the town. Someone had broken out instruments, and music drifted through the open window. "We did it," Clara said softly. "Made it through." "You did it," Hank corrected. "I just held your hand. You did more than that. You told me I could." When I didn't think I had anything left, you reminded me who I was." Clara's eyes were already drooping. "Mother would be so happy, seeing you hold her namesake." "I think she knows," Hank said. "Somehow I think she knows." He sat vigil while Clara slept, watching over both mother and child. Doc had left reluctantly, promising to return first thing in the morning. The town had settled into night, though Hank could still hear occasional bursts of laughter and celebration from the saloon. Dusty appeared in the doorway. Someone must have left the cabin door open, and the donkey moved quietly to stand beside the cradle. He lowered his head and snuffled gently at the sleeping baby, then looked at Hank with those knowing eyes. "You did good, old friend," Hank whispered. "You brought us all together. This little girl exists in this moment because you wouldn't leave Clara alone." The donkey flicked his ears and settled down on the floor beside the cradle, assuming guard duty. Hank smiled. Some things never changed. As the night deepened, Hank found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. Rose's courage in surviving alone, Clara's determination in finding him, the strange blessing of a stubborn donkey who'd known what humans hadn't. All of it leading to this moment, 3 generations united, a baby wrapped in her grandmother's blanket, sleeping peacefully in a room built by a grandfather who'd never stopped loving the woman he'd lost. In the cradle, little Rose sighed in her sleep. Her tiny hand opened and closed, already reaching for the world she'd just entered. A world that would be kinder to her than it had been to her grandmother. A world where she'd know her family, know her history, know she was wanted and loved from her very first breath. Hank reached into the cradle and gently adjusted the blanket, tucking it more securely around his granddaughter. The fabric was worn but clean, every stitch made with love by hands he'd held 30 years ago. "Thank you, Rose," he whispered to the darkness, to the memory of the woman who'd brought them all together. "Thank you for never giving up on love. Thank you for our daughter. Thank you for this." And in the quiet of that moment, with his family sleeping peacefully and a faithful donkey standing guard, Hank Mercer finally understood what he'd been missing all those lonely years. Not adventure or excitement or the thrill of new places, just this, just family. Just love that endured through everything, even death, even lies, even 30 years of separation. Just this simple, perfect gift of belonging. 6 weeks later, autumn had settled over Willow Bend with gentle authority. The cottonwoods wore gold. The air carried a pleasant chill in the mornings, and the land prepared itself for the winter to come. In Hank's cabin, though everyone now called it the Mercer house, life had found its rhythm. Clara stood at the kitchen window, baby Rose sleeping against her shoulder, and watched her father teach Dusty a new trick in the yard. The donkey was being predictably stubborn about it, and Hank's patient voice drifted through the open window. "You're the smartest creature in this territory, but you're making me look like a fool in front of my granddaughter." "Little help here?" Clara smiled. Rose, little Rose they called her to distinguish her from her grandmother, was growing stronger every day. She'd gained weight, her newborn scrawniness filling out into healthy rolls. Her eyes were starting to show hints of brown, like her mother's, like the grandmother she'd never meet but would always know through stories. The recovery had been easier than Clara expected. Doc Brennan visited regularly, pronouncing himself satisfied with both mother and baby. Sarah Chen had practically moved in for the first 2 weeks, showing Clara how to swaddle, how to soothe, how to trust her instincts as a mother. The whole town had participated in raising this child, bringing food and wisdom and help whenever needed. But it was Hank who'd surprised Clara most. He'd taken to grandfatherhood with an enthusiasm that bordered on comical. He'd built a small rocking horse already, even though little Rose wouldn't use it for years. He'd carved a dozen wooden animals for the nursery. He sang lullabies in his rough voice that somehow always put the baby to sleep. And he talked to her constantly about her grandmother Rose, about trail riding, about the stars, about everything and nothing. "She needs to know her history," he'd explained when Clara teased him about having one-sided conversations with an infant. "Needs to understand where she comes from." A knock at the door pulled Clara from her thoughts. She opened it to find a man with a large camera and wooden tripod. "Mr. Morrison," she greeted him. Right on time. Mrs. Mercer, Miss Clara. The photographer was flustered. Hank had commissioned this family portrait weeks ago, wanting to capture this moment, this new beginning. Just Clara is fine, she called out the window. They're here! Hank came inside, brushing hay from his sleeves. Already? I need to change shirts. You look perfect, Clara said firmly. Natural. That's what we want. Mr. Morrison set up his camera in the front yard, arranging them on the porch. Hank sat in his usual chair, Clara beside him holding baby Rose. They'd debated including Dusty, and in the end, the donkey made the decision for them by positioning himself at the edge of the frame and refusing to move. That beast has more opinions than a committee, Hank muttered. But he was smiling. Hold still now, Mr. Morrison instructed, ducking under the camera's hood. And nobody move, for the flash powder ignited with a bright burst and a puff of smoke. Little Rose startled, but didn't cry, already getting used to the chaos of her new world. Mr. Morrison took several more shots from different angles, then promised to have the prints ready within the week. After he left, Clara and Hank remained on the porch. The baby had fallen back asleep, content in her mother's arms. Dusty had wandered off to graze, his duty done. A photograph, Hank said softly. Proof we exist, that we're family. You needed proof? No, but it's nice to have something tangible. Something little Rose can look at when she's grown and understand where she came from. Clara shifted the baby to her other shoulder. I've been thinking about the land. The plot Mother owned. What about it? Henderson said he'd sell it back to us if we wanted. The price is fair, more than fair, actually. He feels bad about how Mother was treated back then. Clara looked at her father. I think we should buy it. Build something there. Make it ours. Hank was quiet for a moment, considering. Your mother tried to build a life there. Didn't work out the way she hoped? Exactly. So we finish what she started. We build the life she couldn't. We make that land mean family and belonging instead of failure and heartbreak. You've thought this through. I have. We could build a house, bigger than this cabin. Room for Rose to grow, room for... Clara paused. Room for whatever comes next. Hank studied her face. You planning on whatever comes next, including more babies? Clara blushed. Maybe someday, if the right person comes along. But even if not, Rose will need space to run and play. That land has the spring, the trees. It's beautiful. It is, Hank agreed. And you're right. We should reclaim it. Make it what Rose wanted it to be, a home. They sat in companionable silence, planning the future. A house with room to grow, a barn for Dusty and maybe a horse or two. Gardens where Clara could grow vegetables and flowers. A place where little Rose could run free and safe, knowing she belonged, knowing she was loved. Pastor Coleman walked by on his rounds and stopped to admire the baby. She's growing so fast. Seems like just yesterday we were waiting to hear if the birth went well. Time moves different when you're happy. Hank observed that it does. Pastor Coleman tipped his hat and continued on his way. As the afternoon wore on, Clara watched her father hold his granddaughter, saw the gentleness in his weathered hands, the love in his eyes. She thought about her mother, young Rose, old Rose, all the versions of the woman who'd loved this man and never stopped loving him, who'd survived impossible circumstances to raise a daughter alone, who'd used her dying breath to ensure that daughter would find her father. Clara touched the locket at her throat, Rose's gift, and the ring on the chain beside it, Hank's mother's wedding band. Past and present linked together. 3 generations of women and the man who loved them all. Thank you, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to her mother, her father, or the strange fate that had brought them together through a stubborn donkey's insistence. For what? Hank asked, looking up from the baby. For being here. For being you. For never giving up on love, even when it seemed impossible. Hank's eyes glistened. I think that's a family trait. Stubbornness in the face of impossible odds. Definitely a family trait, Clara agreed. Little Rose chose that moment to wake up, her small face scrunching in preparation for crying. But then she seemed to reconsider, her expression smoothing out as she looked around at the faces above her. Her tiny mouth curved into what might have been a smile, probably just gas, but Clara and Hank chose to believe otherwise. "She knows," Clara said. "Knows she's loved." "From her very first breath," Hank confirmed. "And every breath after." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Hank thought about the photograph they'd taken. When it was printed, he'd frame it and hang it in the house they'd build on Rose's land. Future generations would look at it and see a family reunited, a love that survived decades of separation, a stubborn donkey who'd brought it all together. They'd see proof that sometimes the stories that seem impossible, that should be impossible, turn out to be the truest ones of all. That love endures. That family finds its way home. That even the deepest wounds can heal, given time and faith, and the stubborn refusal to give up hope. Hank Mercer, who'd spent 30 years as a lonely man, certain his chance for family had passed, held his granddaughter close and smiled at his daughter. His family, his home, his second chance at the life he'd thought he'd lost. And in that moment, with the sun setting over Willow Bend and a faithful donkey braying in the distance, everything was exactly as it should be. Sometimes the answers we've been searching for all our lives arrive in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes through a stubborn old donkey that simply won't leave a young pregnant woman alone. Sometimes through letters that survive decades and love that refuses to die. Sometimes through courage and determination and the simple act of not giving up. But always, always, they arrive exactly when they're supposed to. Bringing us home to the family we were always meant to have just took a little faith, a lot of stubbornness, and one very wise donkey to make it happen.